I never thought my peaceful farm would turn into a war zone until my HOA decided to flood my land with raw sewage and laugh in my face. They thought I would just accept the stench and destruction, but they had no idea who they were messing with. When they ruined my crops, I spent weeks crafting the perfect revenge. And when the time came, I made sure their fancy HOA office drowned in something even filthier than what they sent my way. Welcome to my channel. If you love HOA revenge stories, hit subscribe for more insane tales. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a smell, thick and putrid, drifting into my kitchen just as I was pouring my morning coffee. At first, I thought maybe one of my goats had gotten into something rotten, but as I stepped outside, my stomach turned. A thick, bubbling sludge was spreading across my fields, winding through my crops like some nightmarish river. The air was thick with the stench of human waste. My boots squelched as I stepped forward, eyes wide in horror. This wasn't just some plumbing issue or a backed-up septic tank. This was raw sewage, spewing from an overflowing pipe that I had never seen before. My land, my farm, my livelihood was drowning in filth. I stumbled back, covering my mouth as I gagged. This had to be a mistake. Maybe a county pipeline had burst or some contractor had screwed up. But then, across the road, standing on the pristine grass of the HOA's private clubhouse lawn, I saw a group of people watching. Among them was none other than Greg Pearson, the HOA president, sipping his coffee as if he were admiring a sunrise. Next to him, HOA treasurer Lisa Hampton covered her nose, laughing at something Greg had said. Rage bubbled inside me as I marched toward them. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, waving a hand at the toxic swamp engulfing my farm. Greg turned to me, eyebrows raised as if I were some unexpected guest at a party. "Oh, morning, Jake," he said smoothly, taking another sip of his coffee. "Looks like you've got a bit of a mess there." "A bit of a mess?" My entire lower field was submerged in reeking, disease-ridden water. "This is sewage, Greg. This didn't come from my land. Where is it coming from?" Greg exchanged glances with Lisa, who smirked and shrugged. "Probably just some old pipes acting up," he said. "You know, these rural plumbing systems are a bit unreliable. Guess you should have thought about that before buying land so close to our development." His words hit me like a slap. "This is coming from you, isn't it?" I took another step forward, fists clenching at my sides. "You're dumping waste onto my property," Lisa scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. The HOA recently made some adjustments to our drainage system. It's possible that, some runoff is making its way over here." "Runoff?" I barked out a bitter laugh. "This isn't runoff. This is human waste flooding my crops, my home, my goddamn livelihood." Greg feigned a sympathetic sigh. "Well, that does sound inconvenient," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "But technically, your land is at the lowest point in the area. Gravity, you know. Maybe you should look into improving your drainage." I stared at him, chest heaving, fists aching from how tightly I was clenching them. They had done this on purpose. There was no mistake, no accident. The HOA had deliberately diverted their waste system straight onto my land. But why? Greg clapped me on the shoulder before I could say anything. "Look, no hard feelings, buddy. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Maybe even consider selling this place while you still can." I yanked my shoulder away from his touch, feeling the heat of rage rise in my chest. "You think this is funny?" My voice shook. "This is my home, Greg." Lisa rolled her eyes. "It's just land, Jake. Maybe it's time to move on. We've got a lot of new folks interested in joining the community, and honestly, this whole farm aesthetic isn't really what we're going for." That's when it clicked. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was a calculated move to force me out. The HOA had been trying to buy my land for years, always making offers, always pushing to expand their cookie-cutter development onto my property. I had refused every single time, and now they were done playing nice. Greg must have seen the realization dawn on my face because his smirk widened. "Anyway," he said, "you should probably get started on cleanup. That sewage isn't going to move itself." He turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, Lisa trailing after him with a chuckle. I stood there, trembling with rage, watching as they disappeared into their pristine, perfectly manicured neighborhood while my land drowned in filth. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Then the fight kicked in. I spun on my heel and stormed back to my house, pulling out my phone as I went. First, I called the county health department. After being transferred 3 times, I finally got someone who sounded mildly concerned. "We can have an inspector out by Friday," she said. "Until then, I'd recommend avoiding contact with the contaminated areas." Avoid contact? I barked. Lady, this is my home, my farm. I can't just avoid contact. I understand your frustration, sir, but these things take time. If we determine there's a violation, we can issue a notice to the responsible parties. I nearly laughed. By Friday, my land would be unsalvageable. I needed immediate action, but the system wasn't built for immediate action. It was built for delays, bureaucracy, and loopholes that let people like Greg Pearson get away with poisoning a man's home. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I ran them through my hair, breathing deeply, trying to think. If the county wouldn't help, maybe I could take legal action. I called my lawyer, Brent, who had helped me with property disputes before. He listened carefully as I laid out everything that had happened. This is bad, he admitted. But without immediate evidence that the HOA is responsible, it's going to be tough. You need documentation, photos, videos, anything that can prove they're the source. That was something I could do. I grabbed my phone and ran back outside, snapping pictures of the sewage, the flooded crops, the way the waste was pooling in my lower fields. Then I followed the flow upstream, past the fence separating my land from the HOAs, to where I saw it, a thick, rusted pipe sticking out from the ground near their community clubhouse. It was still spewing waste, gurgling like some monstrous drain from hell. I recorded everything, zooming in on the pipe, following the stream of filth as it slithered down the slope and onto my land. Greg and Lisa had known exactly what they were doing. I clenched my phone so tightly I thought it might crack. This wasn't over. They wanted to play dirty? Fine, I could play dirtier. The next morning, I woke up to an official HOA violation notice nailed to my front door. Hazardous environmental conditions, immediate remediation required. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day. I clenched my fist, barely able to contain my rage. The audacity of these people, they flood my farm with their waste, and now they're fining me for it? I yanked the notice off the door and stormed toward my truck, my boots squelching in the filth that had seeped into the ground overnight. The lower fields were ruined. The once vibrant green of my crops had turned into a putrid brown, coated in a layer of sludge that stank worse than a backed-up sewer. My animals wouldn't go near it, and I couldn't blame them. My dog, Buck, whimpered as he sniffed the air, then backed away, tail between his legs. This was an attack. And Greg Pearson, that smug HOA president, thought he could win by suffocating me in legal red tape. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I spent the next few hours making calls, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen. The county health department had already told me they wouldn't send an inspector until Friday, and even then, all they could do was issue a citation if they found violations. The state environmental office gave me the same response. We'll need to conduct an investigation, and that process typically takes several weeks. Weeks. My farm would be dead by then. My crops, my soil, everything I'd built, ruined. When I asked about emergency action, the woman on the phone sighed. We don't have jurisdiction to intervene unless it's proven to be a direct environmental hazard to public health. I wanted to scream. I needed this to be handled now. Then came the final straw. My neighbor Tom called. Jake, you seen the HOA newsletter today? I hadn't. I was too busy dealing with the destruction. Check your email, Tom said, his voice grim. I pulled out my phone and opened the link. There it was, plain as day. The HOA had sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood claiming that the sewage flooding my land was due to faulty infrastructure on private property. They had the gall to tell the neighborhood that I had failed to maintain my own septic system, and that the resulting contamination was a hazard to the community. My jaw locked. My grip on the phone turned my knuckles white. At the bottom of the email, it stated that the HOA was exploring options to ensure the land is properly rehabilitated and that any property deemed a health risk could be condemned for the safety of the community. That was their play. They weren't just trying to fine me into compliance. They were trying to steal my land. If they could get it declared an environmental hazard, they could force me out. And once I was gone, the same land that was too dangerous to live on would suddenly become the site of their next expansion project. I had no doubt in my mind this was all planned. Greg Pearson had been trying to buy my property for years. I had refused every single offer, and now, since I wouldn't sell, he was using the full force of the HOA to drive me off. I had to act fast. I needed proof, real proof, that this wasn't coming from my land. The video of the sewage spewing from the pipe was good, but I needed undeniable evidence that the HOA was behind it. I needed to find out exactly where that pipe led. That meant getting my hands dirty. I grabbed a pair of waders from my shed, strapped a waterproof flashlight to my head, and followed the flow of sewage back toward the source. The stench was unbearable, but I gritted my teeth and trudged forward. The pipe jutted out from a slope just past the HOA's community clubhouse. It was old, rusted, and had no business being there. It hadn't been part of any drainage system when I bought my land, which meant it had been installed recently. I climbed up the embankment, following the exposed portion of the pipe, until I reached a hatch covered by an HOA-branded access panel. Bingo. I pulled out my phone and recorded everything, close-ups of the pipe, the flow of sewage, the HOA access panel with their name stamped right on it. Then I pried open the hatch. Inside was a shutoff valve, still slick with fresh grease, and a handwritten work order from the HOA's maintenance team. It explicitly detailed a plan to reroute waste flow away from HOA property and into the adjacent land, my land. I felt my stomach churn with rage. They hadn't just accidentally sent sewage my way. They had planned it. I took dozens of photos, backing them up immediately onto multiple devices. Now, I had them. That night, I called Brent, my lawyer, and told him everything. I emailed him the pictures, the videos, the work order. "This is good," he said. "Really good, but we need to move carefully." He explained that while this evidence would absolutely hold up in court, legal action would take time I didn't have. Then he paused. "Wait, HOA board members are elected, right?" I frowned. "Yeah. So what?" he chuckled. "Jake, if this goes to court, their legal fund is going to come straight out of HOA member dues. Do you really think the neighborhood is going to be thrilled about paying to defend Greg and his buddies once they find out they've been dumping waste onto your land?" He was right. I needed to hit them where it hurt. If I could get the rest of the homeowners to turn against Greg and his cronies, the entire HOA would implode. I stayed up late that night crafting an email. I attached every photo, video, and document I had and sent it to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. I titled it, "What Your OA Doesn't Want You to Know, Proof of Illegal Sewage Dumping." Then, I took it a step further. I printed out physical copies, drove around before sunrise, and stuffed them in every single mailbox. By the time the sun was up, the neighborhood was on fire. My phone buzzed nonstop, calls, texts, emails. People were pissed. And just like I'd hoped, they weren't pissed at me. They were pissed at Greg. At the next HOA meeting, I watched with satisfaction as Greg tried to maintain his usual smug confidence, but sweat beaded at his forehead as the room exploded with angry homeowners. "You lied to us!" One woman screamed. "You said his land was the problem, but this says you caused it," an older man shouted. Greg fumbled for words, trying to deny it, but the proof was right there in black and white. His own board members turned on him. Lisa Hampton, the treasurer, threw up her hands. "I had no idea about any of this," she shrieked. "You've been keeping things from us, Greg." For the first time, I saw panic in his eyes. He realized he was losing control. And I was just getting started. Greg Pearson was losing control, and he knew it. The HOA meeting had turned into a riot of shouting homeowners demanding answers, waving copies of the emails and documents I had exposed. His usual smug confidence was cracking under the pressure, but I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I sat back, arms crossed, watching as he stammered through excuses. "This is all being taken out of context," Greg insisted, his face turning red as he tried to talk over the crowd. "We were simply addressing a long-standing issue with neighborhood drainage. By flooding his land with sewage," a woman shouted. "You told us it was his fault. You said his septic system failed, but your own documents prove you diverted waste deliberately." The murmurs of agreement grew louder. Greg looked toward Lisa Hampton, the HOA treasurer, for backup, but she was already backing away from him, shaking her head. "I didn't approve any of this, Greg," she said, her voice shaky. "You lied to me too," I smirked. The cracks were forming. But I needed the board to do something stupid, something that would doom them completely, so I stood up. "Greg," I said, my voice calm but carrying through the packed room, "if this was just a simple drainage fix, why didn't you get the proper permits?" He stiffened. Of course we followed all legal requirements." "Really?" I cut him off, pulling out a thick folder and slapping it onto the table. "Because I checked with the county records office. I checked with the state environmental board, and guess what? No permits were filed, not a single one. The crowd gasped. Greg's face drained of color. You illegally modified a wastewater drainage system, I continued, stepping closer. You bypassed regulations, dumped waste onto private property, and then tried to cover it up by blaming me. That's a felony, Greg. Silence. For the first time since this nightmare started, he looked afraid. His eyes darted toward the board members, but they were already shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing how deep they were in. I wasn't done. See, the thing about environmental violations, I said, is that the EPA doesn't care about HOA politics. They don't care about neighborhood rules. They care about federal law. And what you did, Greg, that's a direct violation of the Clean Water Act. The murmur in the crowd turned into full-blown panic. A man near the front, who I recognized as a retired lawyer, stood up. If this is true, the entire HOA could be financially liable. Greg spun toward him. Let's not jump to conclusions. Jump to conclusions? The lawyer shot back. You diverted sewage onto private land, falsified claims about the source, and failed to file permits? That's a lawsuit waiting to happen? Greg's mask finally cracked. His composure shattered as he slammed his hands on the table. Enough, he barked. This meeting is over. The board will handle this internally. He turned toward the other board members. Executive session, now. Lisa, still looking pale, nodded and quickly followed him into the HOA office at the back of the building. One by one, the rest of the board members shuffled in behind them, leaving the residents outside with me. Exactly what I wanted. I turned to face the crowd. Let me guess, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. They're about to discuss legal action against me. A few people nodded. That's what they do, one man muttered. They get caught doing something shady, and suddenly the people calling them out are the problem. Right, I said, which is why I need witnesses. I held up my phone. I recorded everything that just happened, every word Greg said. If they come after me legally, we hit them with the truth. A few people exchanged glances, but then, one by one, they pulled out their phones. I recorded it too, a woman said. Me too, another added. Perfect. I had just neutralized Greg's first move before he could even make it. If the HOA tried to silence me, they'd have to deal with half the neighborhood in court. Now it was time to make them really panic. I pulled out a second stack of papers. This, I said, holding them up, is a formal complaint I've filed with the EPA, the County Health Department, and the State Environmental Board. More gasps. Oh, and one more thing, I added, flipping to the last page. Greg might not have filed for permits, but I checked county records for his property. I smirked, letting the tension build. Turns out, his own septic system has been out of compliance for 2 years. The room exploded. Are you kidding me? Someone shouted. He flooded a farm with sewage but didn't fix his own system? Greg and the board must have heard the shouting because a moment later the HOA office door slammed open. Greg marched out, livid. This is not up for debate, he yelled. This meeting is over, but I wasn't done yet. Actually, Greg, I said, smiling, there's one last thing we need to discuss. He clenched his jaw. What now? I turned toward the crowd. The OA legally cannot take action on major issues without a community vote. And last I checked, most of you didn't even know this was happening until today. A murmur of agreement spread through the residents. I had them. Greg's grip on the HOA was slipping. So let's vote, I said, stepping forward, right now. We're not voting on this, Greg snapped. Oh, I think we are, I shot back. I turned toward Lisa, the treasurer. Lisa, how much money is left in the HOA reserve fund? She hesitated. It's, around $80,000. Another murmur spread through the room. That's not much, someone muttered. And how much will legal fees cost once the EPA investigates? I asked. Lisa's face drained of color. She knew the truth. They were screwed. If the HOA got dragged into a lawsuit, the entire reserve would be wiped out. And guess what? That money came from HOA fees. Greg was sweating now. He knew that if I forced a vote, he was finished. So I made it easy for him. Step down, I said, or watch the entire HOA collapse under your leadership. The crowd erupted in agreement. Greg's eyes darted around the room, desperate, looking for any way out. But there wasn't one. He was done. Lisa was already backing away from him. Greg swallowed. Fine. He took a breath. I resign. The room exploded with cheers. The HOA was officially leaderless. And I had won. But I wasn't done yet. Greg might have stepped down, but I still had a lesson to teach, one that involved manure, revenge, and a whole lot of humiliation. Greg Pearson may have resigned, but I wasn't satisfied with just watching him slink away with his tail between his legs. He had flooded my farm with sewage, tried to frame me for environmental violations, and attempted to steal my land under the guise of community improvement. A simple resignation wasn't enough. He needed to suffer. The same way he had made me suffer. The same way he had laughed while my crops drowned in filth. The problem was, the HOA wasn't officially dead, not yet. The board had been shaken, but the remaining members were still scrambling to figure out how to clean up Greg's mess without getting sued, and that's where I had an advantage. I knew they were desperate. They weren't worried about their integrity, they were worried about liability. My evidence was strong, but they knew legal battles took time, and most of them still believed they could survive this if they played smart. What they didn't realize was I was already 10 steps ahead. I spent the next 2 days working on my plan, making sure every detail was perfect. It started with a few key phone calls. The first was to my cousin Mike, who owned a cattle farm 2 counties over. "How much manure you got sitting around?" I asked. Mike laughed. "How much you need?" "Enough to drown a building," Mike whistled. "That's a hell of a request, Jake. Who pissed you off?" An entire HOA. There was a pause, then a chuckle. "Say no more. I got a fresh batch just waiting for a home." We made arrangements for a late-night delivery, something special for the HOA board's next big meeting. The second call was to Stanley, a local plumber who had a bone to pick with Greg after the HOA fined him for leaving his work van parked in his own driveway. "I got a job for you," I said. "You like a little revenge?" "I'm listening," Stanley said, intrigued. I told him exactly what I needed, something simple, yet devastating. A little plumbing magic to make sure the HOA office was ready for what was coming. Stanley was more than happy to help. Now, the real trick was timing. I needed the HOA board inside the office when it happened, and thanks to some careful eavesdropping, I found out their emergency meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. Perfect. The fools were going to walk right into their own funeral. I spent the next day laying the groundwork, making sure every piece was in place. Stanley worked his magic in the dead of night, tampering with the office's pipes, while my cousin Mike delivered his special package under the cover of darkness. 20 tons of fresh, steaming manure. By the time Thursday night arrived, I was practically buzzing with excitement. At 6:55 p.m., the board members arrived one by one, Lisa Hampton looking stressed and exhausted. Some of the others who had turned against Greg, still clinging to the hope that the HOA could be saved. Fools. They walked in, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I was parked a block away, watching through a security camera I had planted earlier, a perfect view of the HOA office. At 7:03 p.m., Greg Pearson arrived. I grinned. The rat had come back to the sinking ship. He wasn't supposed to be there, but I had a feeling his arrogance wouldn't let him stay away. He still thought he could control the board, steer them towards saving their own skins. At 7:07 p.m., Stanley's handiwork kicked in. It started with a low, gurgling sound from the pipes, a subtle warning that something was terribly wrong. The board members inside paused, exchanging nervous glances. Then, the first wave hit. Black sludge erupted from the sinks, spraying across the walls, the floor, their expensive boardroom table. Screams filled the room as Greg and the others scrambled back, trying to escape the sudden explosion of pressurized waste. But the real show was just beginning. At 7:10 p.m., 20 tons of cow manure came crashing through the front door, the windows, the vents. Stanley had rigged the plumbing so that every drain, every pipe, every opening in that office became a portal to hell. It didn't just flood the office, it trapped them inside. The doors, now sealed by the sheer weight of filth, wouldn't budge. I had effectively turned the entire HOA office into a septic tomb. The camera feed shook from the force of the impact as the entire room was swallowed in brown sludge. The board members were screaming, gagging, slipping over each other, desperately trying to claw their way toward any exit. Greg was the first to fall, his expensive loafers sucked into the knee-deep muck, his perfectly pressed suit ruined. Lisa was next, her screams turning into gagging wretches as she disappeared beneath the waves. The others were just as helpless, sinking, flailing, fighting against the unrelenting tide of waste. And me? I watched from my truck, sipping a beer, smiling like a man who had just won the lottery. The coup de grace came at 7:15 p.m. when the fire alarm activated, automatically locking the building's doors due to the emergency. The stench sensors triggered the building's ventilation system, meaning every ounce of that smell was now circulating through the vents, ensuring the HOA office would forever smell like a barnyard exploded inside it. I let them suffer for 15 minutes before calling the fire department. When they arrived, they had to break down the door, and the wave of manure that spilled out onto the street was glorious. The news spread like wildfire. The local paper ran the headline, "HOA board drowns in scandal, literally." Social media exploded. Videos of Greg Pearson crawling out of a pile of manure, gagging and retching, covered from head to toe, went viral. Neighbors cheered. People celebrated in the streets. The EPA showed up the next day, and guess what? They fined the HOA for illegal dumping. That fine? $250,000. Greg vanished from public life. Lisa resigned immediately. The remaining board members fled like rats, leaving the HOA leaderless. The final vote was cast a week later. The HOA was officially dissolved, every last remnant of it washed away in the flood of its own corruption. As for me, I kept my farm, and my land remained untouched. I sat on my porch that evening, looking out at my now sewage-free fields, and cracked open a beer. Revenge? It had never smelled so sweet. The HOA was dead, its office reduced to a monument of filth, its board members scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship. But I wasn't done. Greg Pearson had tried to destroy my life, and just because he had been humiliated didn't mean justice had truly been served. I didn't want him to just resign. I wanted to make sure he never recovered. I wanted him to feel the same sense of helplessness I had felt when I watched my farm being swallowed by sewage. And more than that, I wanted to make sure that no HOA in this town would ever dare pull a stunt like this again. So while Greg and the rest of the board were still scrubbing manure out of their skin, I made my next move. I had already filed complaints with every regulatory agency I could think of, the EPA, the county health department, the state environmental board, but those things took time. I needed immediate consequences. So I dug deeper. I went back through the HOA's financial records, documents I had gained access to while preparing my case, and started connecting the dots. The board had been funneling money through bogus maintenance projects, but most of that money hadn't been used for actual improvements. No, it had been redirected into a separate account, an account tied directly to Greg Pearson's name. Greg had been embezzling HOA funds. It wasn't just negligence, it wasn't just corruption, it was fraud, and it was enough to put him in prison. I compiled everything, bank transfers, false invoices, HOA fees that had been misallocated into Greg's personal account, and I sent it to 3 different sources at the same time. My lawyer, the state's attorney general's office, and, just for fun, every major news station in the area. The news hit like a bomb. Within 24 hours, Greg was trending locally, his face plastered across headlines. HOA president under investigation for fraud stole thousands from homeowners. The best part? People he had stolen from started coming forward. Lisa Hampton, his former treasurer, flipped immediately. She claimed she had no idea what Greg had been doing, but she provided emails, texts, and documents proving that he had been doctoring records and hiding transactions. Greg tried to deny everything, of course. He went on the local news, looking even more miserable than when he had been covered in manure, trying to spin some ridiculous excuse about clerical errors and misunderstandings. No one bought it. The county launched a full audit, and within a week, Greg's accounts were frozen. Then, the police got involved. I was sitting on my porch when I got the best text message of my life. It was from my neighbor, Tom. "Turn on channel 7, you're gonna love this." I grabbed my remote, flipped to the news, and there it was. Live footage of Greg Pearson being let out of his house in handcuffs. I had done it. I leaned back in my chair, beer in hand, as the camera zoomed in on Greg's face, his once arrogant smirk replaced by pure, abject horror. The reporters were ripping him apart, talking about the fraud charges, the sewage scandal, the fact that the HOA was now completely dissolved and every homeowner had voted to never allow one again. But it got better. Greg had bought his house using HOA-backed loans that were now under investigation. When the HOA collapsed, so did his financial safety net, and within a month, his house was foreclosed. The last I ever saw of Greg Pearson was his bloated, pathetic face on a news clip, pushing a half-broken shopping cart filled with his belongings out of his once pristine home. He lost everything. And me? I was just getting started. With the HOA gone, my farm was safe, but I wasn't about to let the county forget what had happened. I used the momentum from Greg's downfall to push for new local legislation, rules that would make it damn near impossible for any HOA to form without full transparency, full audits, and severe penalties for misconduct. The town passed it unanimously. No more corrupt HOAs, no more power-hungry board members using fine print to steal land from hard-working people. That was my legacy. 6 months later, I stood on my porch, watching my crops grow strong again, no longer poisoned by Greg Pearson's filth. The air was fresh, the land was clean, and the HOA office? Still condemned. It turned out that when you fill a building with manure, it's really hard to get the smell out. The health department refused to let anyone use it again, and eventually, the town just tore it down. Now, it's a parking lot. And every time I drive past it, I roll my window down, breathe in the fresh, clean air, and smile. Because some messes never get washed away, and some victories, they last forever.